most people realize, just most common people realize that for many children from poor households, the only nutrition that they get effectively is the food that they're fed in school. And indeed, many of the school programs now offer free lunch, even on the weekends, free breakfast, free snacks in between. And so that sounds outwardly like a good thing. Obviously, it's better to eat than to not eat. But when you look at the actual nutrition that the children are fed, these are growing children with growing brains and nervous systems. They need to be getting plenty of protein, plenty of fat. They need to be getting all of the vitamins and minerals needed to grow that healthy brain. But in many cases, all they're getting is carbohydrates. And I want you to explain to us how is that possible? I mean, the science of nutrition has known for decades, the National Institutes of Health, they know exactly what you have to feed a child for them to grow up tall and beautiful and healthy and have the highest IQ possible. So why would we not feed that exact food to the growing children in school? What happened here?
Well, that's a great question, because why aren't we acting on the science that we know? It's kind of more like we're going backwards. I think the big picture answer is not so simple, but one of the big picture answers is that when the dietary guidelines were launched in 1980, they were based on a set of incorrect premises. Our nation really was healthier and had very low obesity rates and almost no diabetes until, say, the mid 1960s. We started to see slight increases, but we didn't have any guidelines about how to eat really until first the American Heart Association came along and said, stay away from saturated fat, and then said, stay away from cholesterol. And then they said, this is all starting in 1961. And then they started saying, well, actually, stay away from fat altogether because there's more calories per gram in fat. It's more dense in terms of calories than the other two macronutrients, protein and carbohydrate. And that whole American Heart Association platform about diet was basically adopted by our government. In 1980, it became our national policy, which is the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. That whole platform: reduce saturated fat, reduce dietary cholesterol, cut back on fat altogether. And if you analyze the diet that the government recommends, it's 51 to 56% of it is carbohydrate. Initially, they were recommending just like 10 to 12 slices of bread per day. Now they became a little bit more diversified, and then actually they realized that was too much bread, that big bottom slab of the food pyramid. So they cut back, but they still recommend 6 servings of grains per day, including 3 servings of refined grains, and up to 10% of your calories is sugar. And that's the formula, right? And 5.5 teaspoons of soybean oil every day. And then if you're going to eat, the protein category has sort of been diminished over the years. Now it includes peas, lentils, nuts, and all of those are not full, complete proteins. I'm sure your audience knows this, compared to meat and dairy and eggs. But if you are going to eat meat, it has to be lean meat because of the saturated fat, and the dairy has to be low-fat dairy. So this is a formula pretty much for ill health. It certainly does not bring about good health. It's not what you would call the ancestral diet, the natural human diet. That is not what we were designed to eat. And it's even worse in schools, because while they generally follow the guidelines, like no butter, only only vegetable oil, tons of grains, but there's no cap on sugar. So you have some percentage, like 89% of school meals exceed even the already high 10% of calories on limit on sugar. I mean, that's why we have just sold out our kids. I mean, they are trying to survive on things like Lucky Charm bars. It literally is a USDA approved food item. And nachos, Doritos, Tostados, Fritos. I mean, just real junk food is what we're feeding our kid. And so part of their explanation, we've been on this bad diet for decades and it's hard to change. The other part of the explanation is the food industry, especially, these packaged processed foods, ultra processed foods, multinational food companies, General Mills, Post, PepsiCo. I mean, they have been lobbying the government forever to get the diet that works for their, those are their products. Those are some products that you're seeing now from the General Mills school site. These are USDA approved products that get fed to kids in schools. So the food industry it's ironic because the USDA is supposed to its mission is to protect our nation's farmers and ranchers, the people who grow and produce the food. But we are, in fact, protecting the ultra processed and protecting and promoting the ultra processed food industry. Ken, I can't hear you.
It's interesting how times have changed, because back in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, the main concern for the federal government was that U.S. citizens get enough nutrition. Many people were malnourished and underfed back then. And so initially they were trying to promote starchy foods and you've got how to can your food, how to preserve your food, because there was food scarcity back then. That was a real thing in the United States. But then with the advent of refrigeration and then refrigerated transportation and the processing, that went away. We now none of us have any problem. I mean, you can trip and fall on a Cheerio bar. They're just out there randomly. But the federal government, it's like like you said earlier, it's hard to turn around a huge ship in the middle of the ocean. And the federal government still seems to be promoting a starvation diet. Like, yes, if my children were starving, I would give them the peach Cheerio bar and the soft baked cookies. I would give them that to keep them from starving to death. But no one in America is in danger of starving to death. Now, people go hungry, no doubt, but that's different. So it's like they still have not shed the skin of a nation that was malnourished and underfed. And so they're still wanting to promote these things. And I definitely know that there's a corporate interest involved, and we'll talk about that later. But just to look at these foods, these things are devoid of nutrition. In no way is this a nutrient dense food that you would think you would want to feed a child so that they could pay attention in school and so that they could actually progress and develop into a healthy, happy, normal adult.
Yeah, I mean, here, let me tell you something that is so ironic, which is that it's actually refined grains that are enriched and fortified with artificial, nutrients like iron and B vitamins. And so that is why I believe the USDA recommends still 3 servings of refined grains a day, because they need those nutrients, even though people do not absorb supplemented micronutrients in that way as well as they do when they get it from real food. But without those refined, enriched grains, we would not even have we wouldn't be coming close to our food. And as it is, the dietary guidelines does not meet goals for nutritional adequacy on a number of essential, crucial micronutrients. That means if you're eating these guidelines perfectly, you're still not getting what you need to in terms of nutrients like potassium, magnesium, just to support basic human life. So
it's such a travesty that people have to be basic. I mean, so, and if you're a child from a poor family, and the only real nutrition that you get is from your school breakfast and lunch and snacks, and this is what you're offered, I mean, you are destined for obesity. You're destined for pediatric fatty liver. You're destined for hypertension, type 2 diabetes. Like literally these foods, if I were to sit down and try to create a food, Nina, it's like, I want this food to be the perfect food to cause type 2 diabetes and fatty liver and hypertension and obesity. this is exactly what I would design. So what did the corporations do? How did they maneuver to so that this is literally accepted by the federal government as acceptable to feed to young innocent children who have no other choice?
Well, I mean, I think all of us, none of us is so naive not to understand that every single one of these food companies has a legion, an army of lobbyists in Washington, and they'll have, at least one person, one lobbyist that just focuses on USDA, right? So getting your products into USDA, defending your grain allotment and recommendation at USDA, and not letting that change. It's so interesting because the narrative that you read out in the press that was largely created by NYU nutrition professor Marion Nestle, and then perpetuated by a great writer, Michael Pollan, but he kind of kept this myth going, is that it's like the big bad meat industry that has been the negative force in creating dietary guidelines. Like, it's been the meat industry. The reason our guidelines aren't working is the meat industry is just the worst lobby. And the meat industry is definitely a big industry. However, when you look at the evolution of the guidelines, who has won and who has lost? That's how you know if lobbying has been successful, right? Everybody's lobbying, but who's won? Not the meat industry, right? They went from being the red meat is barely even recommended because it's really lean meat, which is chicken and turkey, and we've seen like 128% rise in the amount of poultry that we eat since 1970, compared to a 35% drop in the amount of beef and 28% drop in red meat overall. So it's not red meat. In red meat, the whole protein category, as I've mentioned, has gotten shrunken. So meat represents less and less of the protein category. And in 2015, they tried in a little footnote to say that they would like to recommend reducing red and processed meat. That was just a footnote they tried to kind of wedge in there. And then they tried to rationalize a bunch of recommendations based on sustainability arguments. And all of that was taken out. But the meat industry is the loser here. Who's winning? Who's winning? Soybean oil has done very well. Actually, they recently recommended increasing the amount of soybean oil that we consume daily. So since 1970, there's been 89% increase in sale, probably even more now, because when I say to today, that means like 2017 or so. So huge increase in soybean oil. And of course, what you're seeing also in these school products is they're going in and lobbying for the actual contracts in the schools, right? So they're saying, we want our Lucky Charms bowl. We want that on the school, in the school meal approved program. You know who else has, I think, gotten approved by the school meal program is a couple of the fake meat companies. If you can't win in the marketplace, then you mandate it through school lunches by lobbying your federal agency. So, these are large public, or they have, shareholder value, or they're publicly traded companies, and their fiduciary responsibility is to their shareholders, and that is to then sell more of their products. It's their goal and aim is not to make America healthier.
And I think most people understand that about in a corporate structure, your duty is to the board members and the shareholders. But what about the USDA? Are they just completely ignorant of human nutrition needs, or are they just literally evil enough that all they want is for the lobbyists to take them to the best steak restaurant in DC? What's going on in the mind of the USDA people who are approving the very crap that's on the screen right here, right now?
I can only give you some data points that are suggestive, right? I can't tell you what's going on in the mind of people at USDA, but I will tell you. So the expert committee for the dietary guidelines, our group, the Nutrition Coalition, brought about the first ever systematic review of the conflicts of interest on that group, which is appointed for every iteration of the guidelines. A new group is appointed. In 2000, for the 2020 guidelines, 95% of those committee members had at least one tie to a food or pharmaceutical company, and more than half of the group had 30 such ties. One of the people on the committee had 151 ties to companies like Nestle and all the major food companies. So I mean, that's one influence. We also found out that the Office of the Dietary Guidelines itself has almost 100 food industry partners, as they call that. So they work with them and meet with them and figure out ways of working with industry. That seems very cozy and inappropriate to me. And we know that, for instance, the head of the American Soybean Association was the undersecretary of USDA under Trump and came right out of the Soybean Association and went directly back to it right after leaving USDA. So there's a lot of a revolving door that goes on there. So, and I think the other factor is if you look at the office itself at USDA that's in charge of the guidelines, it's staffed by about 30 women. It's all women for some reason, and many of them who have been there for 25 years or more. So this is their policy. They have an intellectual, I don't know if they're going out to steak dinners, but they have a strong intellectual fealty to this particular policy. They seem unlikely to want to change and somehow undermine or discredit their life's work.
And you said that the people at the USDA who make this final decision have ties to the big food industry. Tell us what exactly, when you say ties, and one had over 130 ties, what do you mean by that exactly?
Well, it could be any number of things from our paper, which I don't have right in front of me, but so it could be that they got research funding, they'd be a personal grant, it could be that they got speaker fees, they could be a consultant. In some cases, they were employed by, one was employed as the head of Merck, global some division of Merck. So it's just any connection to one of these companies.
And so they literally are effectively on the payroll of the big food corporations, and yet they are tasked with deciding what gets approved by the USDA for school breakfast and school lunch.
Well, right. They're part of this. It's partly USDA, that office of those 30 women, and then it's partly this expert committee. The expert committee is supposed to have the final say. But I mean, here's another shocking thing that happened for the dietary guidelines. They didn't, for the last go around of them, they didn't review any of the studies on weight loss. They decided to ignore all the studies on weight loss. And they've never actually looked at any studies on diabetes reversal or heart disease reversal, because technically they only deal with prevention. So that's only the part of our population that has not yet been diagnosed with some diet-related disease. So the CDC puts the portion of people who have at least one diet-related disease, chronic disease, at 60% of the population. But the number that came out, I believe it was just last year, was 93% of our population either has obesity, heart disease, is on medication for a diet-related disease, or I can't remember what the last criteria is, but basically like 93% of us of adults are in poor cardiometabolic health. That's astonishing. And that means the guidelines are for 7% of us. Right. So, yep. And they don't even look at the studies for us, for the 93% of us that are not well. They don't even look at that scientific literature.
And so never did it occur to them that perhaps a diet that would reverse type 2 diabetes might also prevent it as well. They just didn't make that gigantic, actually tiny mental leap. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a disease does not exist along a continuum. Once you are tip over into the disease state, then you're the purview of the professional societies, the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association. It's like a turf issue. Then it's their problem. But if you're 6.4 and your H1 hemoglobin A1C is 6.4, you're not yet diabetic, then you get to be covered by the dietary guidelines. But I mean, here's the tragedy of it, is that the food going out to nursing homes and schools and followed in hospitals, I mean, especially, schools and hospitals mean, those are populations with lots of sick people in them, and they're getting a diet designed for healthy people and not even really designed for healthy people. But technically, they have not even looked at the literature for people with any of these diseases. And yet those people are getting this food. I mean, as anybody who's gone to a hospital or seen a hospital photo knows, I mean, those are, those meals are really unhealthy
and untasty.